our talk this afternoon on corruption and whether corruption is growth enhancing in autocracies. With us today is Dr. Shrabani Saha, who's at the University of Lincoln in the UK. She's a development economist, macroeconomist, and associate professor at the business school there. She got her PhD from Massey University in New Zealand and has degrees from Australia and Calcutta also. Her research has mostly focused on issues of development economics, and her newest project that she's presenting here is a sort of new research that she's conducting, and we're very glad that you're presenting here. We're, of course, most keenly interested in the South Asian example, so I assume that there'll be some discussion about that there. So welcome here to ISIS, Institute of South Asian Studies, and what we usually do is a presentation and then leaving some time, maybe half an hour or so, and then leaving some time for question and answers afterwards. So thank you and welcome.
Thanks, Rani, and I'd like to thank everyone for coming to this and listen to my talk. And firstly, I'd like to thank Professor Raja Mohan and Harnik Singh to invite me to present my research, and also like to thank Jordan for doing all the things for arrangement for my visit. So to start with, it is a joint project with Professor Kunal Sen from Manchester University. So in terms of research, my major interest of research, I have started with corruption. Like I have started with corruption in terms of causes of corruption, and looking at the three main issues is economic development, then institutional issues like democracy and economic freedom. Then slowly I have extended that in relationship between corruption and economic growth, because that is a major attraction of research in terms of corruption we see. So this paper, this is a work in progress, so definitely once I present, I would like for some feedback so that will improve my paper. And in terms of corruption, we can see corruption is everywhere. Corruption in developing countries, corruption is private sector, public sector, even corruption we see that NGOs and charitable organizations. So, but the research on corruption and corruption issue is like for a long time we can see that Chanukya's Arthashastra, they have mentioned about corruption. So, but it attracts the attention, especially in the 90s. And in terms of empirical analysis with the data was not previously available. So first data available, international business International, they have started producing some scattered data 1980s. And that is how Mauro, that paper, Relationship Between Corruption and Growth, that is the first empirical paper that published in Journal of Public Economics, and in 1995. We can say that that is the major paper or pioneer paper in the study of economics, corruption, and economic growth. Now, in terms of why corruption is important, we have seen that corruption is especially a major problem in South Asian countries, in Asian countries, and in, say, developing countries in particular. It is treated as a major bottleneck of growth. So now, why corruption is bad for growth, or if corruption is good for growth at all? So that is the main interest of research. Now, before we go for like empirical study or doing some test, or doing analysis with the data, we can say in terms of corruption theoretical point of view, till now there are two major schools. Is one, corruption is greasing the wheel, and oppositely corruption is sand in the wheel. So definitely major importance goes in the sand in the wheel, but still we need to know that why corruption greases the wheel. So in that case we say that why corruption? Because if we think of business, they need to start business, they need lot of interaction with public officials. They need to buy permit or so that is how even business, they do international trade, they need lot of permits. So they need to interact with the public officials. And that is the thing, like how we can see sometimes greasing point of view, maybe there are so many application comes for visa or permits. So it is a point of judging that efficiency point of view, that the most efficient firm, they can make more profit, so they can make more bribe, or bribe is paying that to get the like visas or permits they need for the business. So that is one way indication that, oh, it is maybe a good indicator of efficiency, because higher efficient firm, they make more profit, they can make more, pay more. So in that point of view, there is a literature and theoretical aspect that corruption is greasing the wheel. And also, like we say, it is a red tape, because if I need to get thing done, otherwise I cannot do anything. So that means that if I pay and my things are happen, then it is helpful for me in terms of business or even in terms of individual when they need. So that is the way that it can overcome, bribe payment can overcome the red tape. So that is how we can say that it is good. And also we can say that especially developing countries, where we see that government officials, their salaries and wages are very low. So in that way, it can give them incentive to get more bribe, so that they work hard and that can compensate their lower income. So this is another way of looking at that why. And in terms of the literature, that is how literature thought that it is a good enhancing thing. And like I can share my experience. One time I was traveling from overseas, and then I had more heavy luggage, and I need to pay extra money, so I cannot take that. It is very expensive. So I thought that, oh, I can send it as unaccompanied luggage. So that's why I sent it to unaccompanied luggage. And when I landed to India, I think 14 days, 2 weeks gone, I have no idea where was my luggage, how to collect that luggage. And then suddenly after 2 weeks, I received that letter, oh, you have to pay that money because we are keeping your luggage, so you need to pay the rent. So I thought that I was really struggling where to contact. Then I contacted the airline, and they said, oh, you need to go to the like where the luggage is there. They just said the place. But I really tried to get that calling, but no clue was there. But finally, when I know that place where I need to go, I went there in the morning, and I have seen that so many people outside. Oh, there are agent, and said, oh, now they are like bargaining, you pay this money, this amount of money, I can take your luggage. I said, why? I cannot go directly. No, you cannot go directly. This is the way you can get your luggage quickly. So I went, next day I went there, and I was there in the morning 9 o'clock. And then I found one agent, okay, I give this amount of money. And I have seen that, because then I signed the form, and I can see that there are so many government officials there. To get that luggage, they need to go to different places. And what the agent is doing, filling up the form and doing everything and paying some amount to every VAT. So I can see that the government official is doing nothing, just sign it, and agent is doing on behalf of them. So there are so many layers, one by one, and then I can see that finally I collected my luggage around 4:30. So from 9 to 4:30 I was there, I was watching. But the thing is here, when I saw that, I realized that few things. Definitely I paid extra money. Maybe I could pay to government department. I paid it as an agent, to the agent. But I got my luggage. So maybe I had to take some trouble to stand there and things. But I paid money, so I got my luggage back. So second thing is, I can see that there are so many agents, they are standing there, they are not government official, nothing. But they are getting also income, and that is their life. That is their income they are getting. So this thing I can say that if I need to do something and I need to pay money, whether as a to get thing done, whether I pay in the government department or private sector, that doesn't matter to me. I just need to get thing done. So if it is happened, then I think that okay, good. Because if I could not pay that the agent, then it was really difficult for me to get that luggage. So this is one way of looking at that. Yes, corruption is good in terms of increasing efficiency. But definitely this is one side of it. Opposite way is sand in the wheel, because we can see that once I pay money, I am not sure that first thing involved is uncertainty. Too much uncertainty is involved in it, because it is not necessary that I am paying, that means that get things done. Like lot of investors, and they pay money for their either political leaders or things, but still maybe it is taking long time, and again political leaders or public officials, they are coming back again and again to get more bribe. So that is the theory or argument that it increases uncertainty. We are not sure that the things will be done even after paying bribes, and it is possible that the public officials or political leaders come back again and again to get extra money. So that is has a negative impact on investment. So that is the sand in the wheel argument, that corruption, it increases the red tape, it increases the uncertainty. So that is how it has a severe impact on investment. So that is theoretically, that is the sand in the wheel hypothesis. Now, in terms of empirical literature, as I mentioned, first started with Mauro 1995, that looks at the relationship between corruption and growth. And Mauro finds that it has a severe negative impact on investment. That means what is the channel that corruption has negative effect on economic growth? So we know that investment is a major engine of growth. So corruption has negative effect on investment, because if I get frustrated, maybe I withdraw my investment. I don't want to go ahead. So that has a negative impact on investment, and that through that it has negative impact on growth. So, and also after that, lot of study they have started looking at that, like well known is also Kiefer and Knack and Renica and Sevention 2005, they have other channel like human capital, misallocation of resources. So these are the channel that has negative impact on economic growth. So like also corruption, we see that it is a very secret activity. So because it is secret activity, so the investment would go where there is a high probability of not getting caught. So in that way, the investment goes where there is less transparency. Like investment on education and health is very transparent. So those countries where corruption is very high, we see that less investment on that productive investment on education and health, more on infrastructure or buying like jet and things. So that is how we can see that literature shown it has negative impact. And especially most of the literature, they show that rather than positive effect, it has some mostly negative effect. But on the other way, so there are some like estimate, it says Mauro find that a 1 standard deviation increase in bureaucratic integrity will lead to a 5% point increase in investment and increase in annual growth rate by 0.5 percentage point. Similarly, Fishman and Stevenson estimate a 1% increase in corruption leads to a 3% reduction in farm growth. Then Moore 2001, it finds that 1% increase in corruption level reduces the growth rate by 0.72%. Then Pellegrini and Galla 2004 find that a 1 standard deviation decrease in corruption leads to increase in growth of 1% per year. So most of these studies, these are very well-known studies in corruption, and most of the studies, they find that there is a negative relationship between corruption and economic growth. And also, after, I think recently, or we can say after 2005 or 2000, there are some studies, they find that because the study I have discussed, mostly they have looked at the linear relationship. But recent few studies, relationship between corruption and growth, they have found that there may be a nonlinear relationship. Maybe it is inverted U shape when the corruption level is very low, because even we say developed country, they have some level of corruption, because zero level of corruption is very difficult to see in any country. So some level of corruption is everywhere. So that is how we can see that some paper or research has shown when the corruption is very low, maybe it is growth enhancing, and when corruption goes very high, or maybe it is pervasive, everyone is doing corruption, in that case we can see that the effect is negative. Now that is how we can see that not very, so some of the literature, they have started that findings like there may be some positive effect on growth, and especially we can see that East Asian paradox, some countries like India, China, or especially some Asian countries, they are doing very well in terms of growth. But at the same time, we can see there is a very high level of corruption there. Like if we say that, I'll show later, like India, if you look at the growth level is after the economic liberalization, the growth rate is very high, like 6%, 7%. But if you look at the, say, Transparency International, they provide the perception index, corruption perception index. And if we say that their corruption perception index, initially they have like 0 to 10. So 10 means most clean country and 0 is the most corrupt country. And if you look at the average, so India's corruption is below average. That means it is one of the highest corrupt countries. So that is the question, is that we can see that they are highly corrupt, but their growth is also increasing. So that is the question raised, and that's the thing like researcher is looking for. Is there any scope that corruption can be engine of like greasing the wheel? That concept can apply and it can enhance economic growth. Now, and that is how we look at that point of view based on institutional structure, like whether a country is like autocratic countries or the country is democratic countries. So we are basically in this project, we are trying to look at based on that economic institutional structure, democracy or autocracy. What is happening, this relationship between autocracy, this relation corruption and growth in autocracy, and whether democracy is good for enhancing economic growth even in the presence of corruption. So now if we look at democracy and their relationship to growth, so there is also not very clear or conclusive findings we see. So like Barrow is again very well known study that looked at the effect of democracy on growth. And Barrow looked at like 84 countries, and for the period of separate like 1965 to 75, there were 7 different periods, 75 to 85, 85 to 90. And this finding shows that weakly negative relationship. That means more democracy basically not good for growth, it's negative effect. So on the other hand, we can see because Tavers and Wisiger 2001 also obtained the similar results with cross-sectional data. But on the other hand, we see that some studies, they have a positive effect using panel data. So more democracy is basically increasing economic growth. And recently Asimoglu that et al. Find a sizable and robust effect of democracy on economic growth using panel data and GMM method for 175 countries, 1960 to 2010. So this paper finds a sizable impact, positive effect of democracy on growth. So we can see that in terms of the relationship between democracy and economic growth, there is no clear-cut answer for that, whether it is enhancing or inhibiting. So our motivation here to see like some evidence, a set of studies have highlighted the so-called East Asian paradox, where countries in North and Southeast Asia grew rapidly in spite of high level of corruption. Also, we can see that observed positive relation between corruption and growth has been attributed, at least in part, so to the authoritarian regime prevalent in this country, but which is more growth enhancing. But oppositely, we have seen that in autocratic regime in Africa and Latin America, the effect is not good, that more negative effect on growth. So that is how we are here to examine that what is the relationship between corruption and economic growth in this different regime. Now, in terms of theoretical perspective, if we look at autocracy and democracy, what is the relationship? Why we say that autocracy is basically a monopolization of power. So, like it is a again well-known study by Shelfer and Bishne, which found that when a country moved from autocracy to democracy, so transition stage, which is more like joint monopoly to individual monopoly. So every political leaders or public officials, they are thinking that I am monopoly. So that is how in central authority, where more joint monopoly was there, so profit was maximized and output was much greater. But we see that during the transition period, and because of individual monopoly, joint monopoly to individual monopoly, so it is a loss of output and loss of profit. So that is a deleterious effect on economic growth. So again, so we can say in autocratic regime long term, and also we can, on the other hand, democracy is diffusion of power. So there are checks and balances, transparency is there. So it is difficult to do lot of corrupt activities in that sense, and it is high probability of getting caught and punished with the presence of media and presence of strong, sound judiciary. So that is the effect in terms of democracy. Maybe some literature says democracy is good for, even my studies found that democracy is good for like controlling corruption. So more democratic the country is, all these characteristics or dimensions of monopoly, especially a democracy, if it is goes more towards consolidated democracy, where all that political parties are there, opposition are there, checks and balances are there, sound judiciary and media presence. So all this effect can have a strong control on corruption, which is not there in autocracy, because corruption is a secret activity, so it is more difficult to continue that in democracy. Now we can think of like other way of looking at why democracy may be good for economy, autocracy is good for, because autocracy we can say that it is long term. Decision making is more concrete, or credibility may be present there in more autocracy than democracy, because democracy is changing government like every 4 to 5 years. But some investment for growth which need long term investment. So which is more easy for, that decision is more easy to take in autocracy rather than democracy. So that point of view, we can say that bribe taking by politician from far may not be deleterious effect on investment and growth, as deals offered by politician to the firm are likely to be ordered, and firm can be confident that politician will deliver the deals that they have entered within that contract. So that is how that business or investors, they have faith or credibility on that promises, and that can have positive effect on investment, and that means more growth. But alternatively, we can say that democratic regime, they have frequent change of ruling parties, commitment made by politicians are less likely to be credible, and that increases uncertainty, so lower economic investment and lower economic growth. But again, we can say that argument like democracy, there is a possibility of detection and punishment, so that can have increasing transparency and accountability. It can have positive effect on investment and growth. So we have different argument based on that. So that is how our study is looking at what is the effect in terms of the data analysis, and we are going ahead. So this paper examines whether corruption growth relationship is different in autocracies than in democracy. So we test the corruption growth relationship based on political regime. It is a panel data analysis, more than 100 countries, and it is a period from 1984 to 2012. And since the relationship between corruption and growth, it has some endogeneity issues, so it can go in other way. So we have used that system GMM to control that endogeneity issues here. And to test the mediating effect of political regime on corruption, we have used the interaction or moderation effect to look at the effect of corruption on growth based on different level of democracy or autocracy. So our model is based on that. Here real GDP in terms of growth, real GDP per capita growth is the dependent variable, and corruption, democracy and the interaction term, which is the main focus of the variable of interest, and other standard control variable for growth like education, population growth, investment, government standard, final consumption, openness, inflation. So these are the standard control for economic growth. So the sign and significance of alpha 4, that is the most interesting one here. And the marginal effect or partial effect is looked at the effect of corruption on economic growth at different level. So we can see that if marginal impact of corruption on growth is in the presence of democracy here, so if alpha 4 is less than 0, then a 1% increase in, because we are expecting that corruption has negative effect on economic growth without democracy. So based on the literature result, and then if alpha 4 is negative, that means more democracy is basically lowering economic growth. But if alpha 4 is positive, that means democracy is good for economic growth. So that is how we need to see what is the sign of alpha 4. So oppositely, we can look at effect of democracy on economic growth at different level of corruption. If a country has lower level of corruption, then what is the effect of democracy on growth? Or if a country is very corrupt, then what is the impact of democracy on growth if high level of corruption is there? So now corruption data, because like I said initially that studying or researching corruption is the most difficult was previously because lack of data. And now around 80s, some organization they have started collecting or producing corruption data. Now the most of the data available for corruption are perception data, subjective data. Because initially, I think beginning of 1980s, some United agencies they have started collecting objective data. And it was a criticism that if we say objective data, it is reflecting more on countries' judicial system, how they are getting caught and punished, rather than just corruption activity. So that's why it was not very well used and they stopped producing it. Now most of the data they have like perception data, subjective data. So mostly nowadays there are 3 different data sets which is available. One is political risk services. They are producing international country risk guide data. They produce political risk, they produce economic risk and financial risk. So this data is very well known and used in the literature, and this data is not like available, free available. It is, we need to purchase the data. They have also annual data and they have monthly data. So monthly data definitely very expensive, and because corruption doesn't change every month, so it is mostly people use that annual data. And after that, since 1995, Transparency International, they have also started producing data since 95 and annual data. So like transparency, there is a difference between political risk services data, corruption data and Transparency International, because political risk services, they produce, like I said, political risk component. Out of that they have, I think, 12 component of political risk. Out of them 1 component is corruption. So that is now their data is basically the in terms of foreign investors. When foreign investors go to a country to invest, so whether they need to pay bribe or not, what is their experience, so the data is collected based on that point of view. But Transparency International data, they are not only focused on foreign investors, they are like they have different organization. Like how they collect the data, they have different organization. They interview like police corruption, then different hospital, education sector, different sector they have that, and based on that they produce the data set. And another important data we get from World Bank governance indicators, where they have like from 1996. Initially it was biannual, but now we can see that annual data is available. But one thing is, all these three data set we can see high correlation is there. So in this study I have used both, main focus is international country risk guide data, and then I have used that Transparency International data. Because one advantage is international country risk guide that is available 1984, so we have a long observation and long period, but Transparency International is 95, so that is the disadvantage. Now the data is from International Country Risk Guide 0 to 6. 6 means the most clean country or lower risk, and lower the value means higher risk. But for the purpose of study, I have changed it to higher value means higher corruption. And transparency also same thing. They have like initially they have higher value means most clean countries, lower value means most corrupt countries. So their value was available 0 to 10. So again for the easiness, we changed that. 10 means most corrupt and 0 means less corrupt. Now in terms of democracy data, there are different democracy data available. Freedom House, International Country Risk Guide they provide, Polity4. So in this case we have used that democracy data from International Country Risk Guide. They define democracy is a country where change of government is need to do or provide services to the people or public or citizen. So if they cannot do that, then maybe change of government, and if that change of government in a peaceful manner, then it is more democratic country. But if it is not in a peaceful manner, then it is more autocratic. So that is how they define. And then also we have used that Polity2 data set, which is available like 21 scale 1 to 21 we made it. Higher value means higher democracy. So Polity2 data set, they are focus on competition, execution and participation, competitiveness. Based on this component they provide data. So in terms of just go to South Asian countries, so we see that South Asian countries' economic performance was not very good in 1970s and 80s. So that time real GDP growth rate average around 3% per annum, and real GDP per capita growth was 1 to 2% annually. And also the rate of growth has not been sufficient to deliver the job, so more unemployment, nor has it sufficient to provide social and economic infrastructure necessary to development. So, but we see that different scenario in 90s, rise in growth level, but per capita income is still perform poorly, and India experienced a significant increase in income, especially 90s post-liberalization period. So just to give some picture here, we can see that especially the most changes in India after that globalization or economic reform, their growth rate increases and per capita income is getting high. So in South Asian country we see that Sri Lanka and India is performing much better compared to others. Now definitely several explanation that incidence of corruption, because South Asian countries we see that most corrupt than non-South Asian countries in terms of looking at the corruption data. So and also that political aspect not like note that issues of democracy is a problem. India is the most democratic country, but other countries, they have a problem with democracy, economic freedom, because economic freedom is very important. That can reduce corruption. It is easy of getting permit and licenses. So economic freedom is the one of the factor that can control corruption, but which is not very good in these countries. Now in Asia, many nations are still characterized by high increasing level of corruption, and the democratic structure of these have proven markedly ineffective in curbing corruption. And this is some figure about corruption and democracy. So we can see that here it is average like 85 to 2009, 5 years average. So here we can see that black one is high level of corruption and democracy is very low. For India, we have like high level of democracy, but compared to that, Bangladesh here corruption is lower. But Pakistan, we see that high level of corruption, but democracy is not that good. And here in Sri Lanka, we see that in terms of democracy and corruption, they are in the moderate level. So the openness of the economy, economic freedom, that is the good which can attract FDI, external market, and bring efficiency. So a factor that control economic freedom. Okay, now I don't have enough time, so I can go here to show that in terms of openness. So here we can see that openness, which is Sri Lankan in this much better than other countries, but India, we can see that here has improved a lot, especially after 2000. But other countries, economic freedom has not been improved that. And this is from the data set we can see that growth, GDP per capita growth, corruption and democracy in South Asian countries. So we can see that India, it has that higher level of growth over the period 1984 to 2012. And definitely here we can see that corruption is the similar like India and Sri Lanka similar, but Bangladesh and Pakistan, their corruption level is higher. So you can look at if it is 0 to 6. 6 means most corrupt. So in that case, 4.53 is very high level of corruption there. And democracy, definitely we know India is the largest democracy. So this is the situation in just descriptive statistics, looking at the average in South Asian countries. Now,
I'm sorry, can I just ask
yeah,
a question on that? The level for democracy, what are you calculating that on? Is it an average using what quality data? Because the values actually change for these countries during that time period.
No, this is just average. So we can see over the time maybe it has changed, but it is from 1984 to 2012. That is the average data.
For democracy.
Yeah.
And what data are you
It is again international country risk card data. So it is from 0 to 6. 6 means the highest level of democracy.
Because the previous one you had Freedom House data that you were using.
No, we have Freedom House data. We use the international country risk guide. Oh, that one is yes. Yeah. Okay. Now here that average scatter plot of corruption and real GDP. So it has some minor negative relationship we can see, and this is the average for average democracy and GDP. We can see that there is some positive tendency. So in terms of relationship, we can say that average growth from 1984 to 2012, China average growth 9%, and the corruption score is 3.2%, whereas the growth rate in Congo Democratic Republic is minus 3.09, and corruption is 5.36. That can pick up that some positive relationship. Now, figure 2 also shows that positive relationship between per capita growth and democracy. So here we can see country like Botswana and Estonia, they have greater democracy, exhibit higher growth. On the other hand, Brunei and Libya, we can see that lower growth, do not have enough democratic freedom. So based on these two, some example, we see that there is some positive relationship. More democracy means higher economic growth. Now, this is the result for 100 countries, panel data, system GMM result. So here we can see that column 1, which is corruption, is positive but not significant. Democracy is positive and significant, but the most important or focus term is interaction effect, corruption and democracy. So over there we can see it is negative and significant, weakly significant, 1% level. And when we add the other control variables, so over there we can see that still democracy or interaction effect is negative and significant. So it is that use the international countries guide, but column 3 and column 4 that uses polity to democracy index, and using that index also we can see that corruption and democracy, that interaction term is negative and significant. So when we add the control variables, so that also shows negative and significant level increases. So here we can say that corruption has positive effect on growth, but it is not significant. But increase in democracy, we can say that it has lowering the effect on growth, negative effect. And so based on both data set, international countries guide and polity 2, we can see that similar negative effect result. So we can say that coefficient of democracy is positive and significant, which has a like enhancing economic growth, but the interaction term between democracy and corruption, that shows democracy and corruption together have significant damaging effect in the country. So negative effect on growth. So it suggests that effect of corruption and growth on growth is less positive at that as the country get more democratized. So next is we have done some marginal effect. So yeah, just very quickly. So marginal effect shows that, like initially in the left, when the democracy level increases at different percentile, and we can see that initially the effect of corruption, that means at a lower level of democracy like 10 percentile, effect of corruption on economic growth is positive and significant, but weakly significant. But when the level of democracy increases like 95 percentile, we can see that effect of corruption on growth is negative and significant. And on the other hand here, marginal effect of corruption, marginal effect of democracy at different level of corruption, that means when at a 10 percentile, that means very low corruption, for example country like Germany, effect of democracy on economic growth is positive and significant. That means if a country is very low level of corruption, then democracy enhances economic growth. But we can see that when there is very high level of corruption, then democracy, positive effect of democracy on economic growth is basically going negative or less, lower and lower. So we can say if a country is less democratic, then an increase in corruption is associated with greater economic growth. And once the threshold is over, like between 58 to 75 percentile, a higher level of corruption, substantially lower growth as the economy becomes more democratic. And also worth noting that the effect of corruption is significantly positive when at the 10% democracy is good for economic growth. But when corruption is very high, then democracy is not very good for economic growth. So the results remain the same. Here we haven't shown that Transparency International CPI. So using that Transparency International CPI, the effect is very similar. We have used both for International Countries Guide Democracy and Democracy for Polity 2 data. So similar result. And this is like a marginal effect of corruption on growth. So we can see if we go to the right where more democracy, that growth level is going down. And in this case, marginal effect of democracy on growth. So if corruption goes higher, that means towards most corrupt country. So democracy is good for country where corruption is very low. So that enhances economic growth. But when corruption is very high, in that case we can see that the effect on growth going down. So overall our result that threshold level marginal effect of corruption is between 3 to 4. So that means changing democracy, suggesting that after threshold level democracy economic growth decreases as corruption level increases. And threshold level for corruption is between 5 and 6. So marginal effect of corruption is little lower than the threshold level. Marginal effect of democracy is between 5 and 6. So overall conclusion, the effect of corruption on growth is positive in autocracies compared to democracies. That is our data analysis suggests. So result provides support of so-called East Asian paradox, where high corruption and high growth, that suggests that like the effect is benign effect of corruption on growth because authoritarian nature of political regime. So large duration of their development experience. On the contrary, average democratic countries, the effect of corruption on growth is likely to be strongly negative. So that is the thing, our result basically focusing on in autocracies, if the promises to business and individual by political leaders is credible, that can have positive effect on economic growth. But in democracies we can see that changing parties and thing, and so in that case maybe that promises to business is not very credible, so it has lower investment and lower growth. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you. Very interesting and maybe somewhat counterintuitive, some of the findings that you have. I'm just going to take the privilege and ask a couple of questions that struck me, and then I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. But I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about the factor time. You're looking at data sets that are 2-3 decades long, and and I understand you're looking at over 100 countries you mentioned, but if you pick out a couple of examples, say Pakistan,
Okay.
Which has had a change of regime and has been democratizing, so the Polity Index will actually show a change in the democracy level, and yet no impact on corruption has not changed, and economic growth rates from what you've seen is just in line with the changes in South Asia overall, which have all shown. So sort of the question of time, and in particular when you look at case studies from South Asia. And then I guess I was just wondering how much of this is a regional effect. You mentioned the East Asia, but what about Africa? How do you explain the many authoritarian regimes, high corruption levels, and low economic growth? So those questions
Yeah,
for you, and then we can open up.
Yeah, thank you. Because initially, like we have mentioned, that this positive effect is not everywhere we found. That effect is more like East Asian paradox is positive, but in Africa we have seen that the effect of autocracy has a very negative effect on economic growth. But I think it is a good suggestion. Maybe we can take the average, say we can divide the data before 2000 and after 2000, and then see that, because after 2000 and especially after 90s, lot of countries they went for autocracy to changes in like it's a democratization, because beginning of 90s lot of countries, like if you look at Czech Republic, was very vulnerable that time, but we can see over time that Czech Republic, their per capita income is very high. So that's why I'm saying maybe we can divide the time period. Arbitrary. Yeah, arbitrary. Or maybe, because if we say that global financial crisis, that is too different way to look at. But if we look at like autocracy, that moved to lot of countries moved to democracy during 90s, but initially the study said that initially that autocratic newly born democratic countries are in a very vulnerable stage, so maybe the effect will go negative. So if we look at, say, lot of countries, they move beginning of like 89 90s, and if we look at say 2000, they have enough period to stabilize. So that is my thinking. Maybe we can go again, it is arbitrarily, maybe look divide the sample.
The more arbitrary it becomes, the less useful it becomes, isn't it?
Yeah, so another way we can definitely say, okay, 1990, because most of the country they get democracy in 1990. So before 1990, then we have, before 90 we have only say 7 or 8 period, but after 90s we have. But again, we have looked at Transparency International data, which is from 1995. So yeah, and they have a very similar effect.
Okay, questions? While we go around the room. And if you could just say who you are. And
my name is Lam Chi Chung. I'm in investment management. I wanted to delve a bit more into the East Asian paradox, because I'm just wondering what the data set is, because as you said, a lot of these countries are, presumably now democracies,
Yeah.
but they were autocracies or before.
Yeah.
And so were you looking at them before? Was that your data set? And which countries? It seems like, how big is this data set to comment about the East Asian paradox, which is a bit related to her African question, as seen more broadly. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your comment. The data set is from 1984. So 1984 to 2012.
So when you talk about the East Asian paradox, you're really talking about what these countries before they became democracies, like Korea and Taiwan, or which countries are which are your East Asian?
I think these countries are like Taiwan. These are all included in the total 100 countries. And the only thing we can say, because maybe if we say, okay, these countries they move from autocracy to democracy, but the point here is when we looked at Transparency International data, so that is basically available from 1995. So that result also confirmed this positive effect, negative effect.
But by then most of them already kind of democracies.
But even their democracy, if you look at the democracy data, we say India is the largest democracy in the world. But when we look at the democracy data, even Freedom House, for example, so they have different components. One is political rights, civil liberties, and media freedom. So if we combine these all three, we can see that India's average democracy score is around 6 out of 10. Why is that? Because India political rights and civil liberties, they are top. But if we look at media freedom, that include 40% of media freedom based on judiciary. So that is the thing where we can see is lacking, because that means if we combine as a whole, then India is definitely democracy in terms of voting right and other things. But if you look at democracy, when we talk about consolidated democracy, that is more focused on media freedom and judiciary, sound judiciary, which we say significant effect on controlling corruption, where we see that India is not very strong.
My question is more on the East Asian autocracy. So my question is maybe, can you just anecdotally say which East Asian countries support your thesis? It sounds like China, probably, but which other ones, would support your thesis that of the East Asian autocracy paradox, that the more corruption is better for growth in an East Asian autocracy? I can only think of China, but which other ones would, sort of, in your data, would anecdotally support your finding?
I think in that way, because we have East Asian countries, we included Taiwan, then we have.
Your definition is too sharp.
Yeah.
The same problem, right?
I think we can do one thing is based on that total sample, we can take out the subsample for East Asian paradox, and then we can run the similar regression, and that can show that if we have a similar result. So that we can do in that way, just make a subsample for East Asian countries.
Sorry, Shojan, James Crabtree. Well, maybe gather a couple of questions.
Thank you for your interesting presentation. I think your research is very interesting and significant, and I followed Dr. Sen's study, which actually stopped at the early 2000 that year level on the correlationship between corruption and economic growth in India in particular. I guess this is the project you can extend from that study, I guess. And I have many problems, but I have a really big problem with your intermediate variable, which is the autocracy and democracy. And it sounded like the sole factor on the the peaceful transition of regimes in each country is the index for the democracy, that assessment. But probably you elaborated 2 or 3 more the factors for that, but that's I think it's quite problematic to me as a political scientist, and I think you need to define the the factors and indices for that autocracy and democracy in your study in the future. So, for example, I think I have a really similar opinion that was raised by this gentleman. So, for example, look at the East Asian countries like Korea and Singapore. Both countries have made a peaceful transition in regimes for the past 2 or 3 decades, but one country, Korea is a democratic country, but Singapore is not. So how do you explain this kind of East Asian paradox? And also, I think I would like to suggest you don't really go for autocracy or democracy. Maybe you can put intermediate variable as more like peaceful transition of regimes. I think that makes more sense to me.
Thank you.
I think we'll gather a couple of questions at a time so that we can finish up by 1:15. So.
I'm completely fine with your intermediate variable. Don't worry. But so this is an interesting question. Before I answer the question, my understanding of the East Asian paradox, the guy who founded it, the chapter in his book, makes a distinction between Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, and so the paradox in his work is much stronger in Southeast Asia. So you're thinking of Thailand and Malaysia, I guess. Hong Kong and Singapore don't even really figure in that, because in the period they're talking about, they don't really have much corruption, or not formally. So it's more of a kind of Southeast Asian phenomenon, as I have understood it, although maybe Korea is a different case. So my questions, could you just, the final slide, could you just unpack a little bit about, you just touched on at the end because you ran out of time, the question of why you think this issue of commitment, maybe give I mean, are we talking about big investment projects that if you build steel mills and power plants in great number, this increases growth, or just unpack that a tiny bit more, because that seemed like the big conclusion, but we ran out of time. Secondly, given that, in a sense, could you tell us for yourself, where does that put you on the greasing the wheels against sanding the wheels? Sort of, what's your, are you? Don't say it depends. Sort of, which side of this do you ultimately come down on? And then finally, if you were Narendra Modi in India, I had a conversation with Arvind Subramanian, the chief economic advisor, a while ago, where he said, off the record, actually India probably needs a bit more corruption at the moment. He never wrote that down. In a sense that maybe you might kind of make that bargain and think, we had high growth and higher corruption in the mid-2000s. At the moment, investment is very low, maybe a little bit of corruption. Maybe we can't do this, but maybe in theory it would be useful. So if you were Narendra Modi, how would you think about India's particular situation?
Thank you. So in terms of, like, when I started that two concept of corruption, one is that helping corruption for growth, and other one is like negative effect. So in that sense, we can say in democracy, maybe because of that pervasiveness of corruption, difficult to believe on political leaders, credibility, all these issues that has effect on sand in the wheel effect, and which is we can say that negative effect on corruption. But in autocracy, because of these factors, because decision making, investment decision making are autocratic, maybe they run maybe 15-20 years, so they can easily take any credible investment decision. And again, I think the question is here is credibility is more important, because maybe we have seen African countries, their political leaders were not very credible enough. They got the money and maybe they used that, send their money overseas. So in that case, we can see that it is negative effect on corruption. But if it is more credible enough, then it has engine positive, like we say that it is helping economic growth by pushing the engine of the growth. So that is our analysis in terms of saying that if it is has some commitment, credibility, which can help them to believe investors, whatever the political leaders is committing, they can follow their commitment, and they are not extracting 100% of their rent in their pocket. So in that case, it is a good investment situation, and that can enhance growth. But on the other hand, in democracy, because we see that there is a possibility of believing political leaders. So, and then political leaders, if they exploit and they are not keeping their commitment, so in that case it increases uncertainty, and that has sand in the wheel effect and negative effect on growth.
And just to follow up a question our colleague asked, so China obviously fits that model brilliantly. Mentally, when you're thinking about autocracies that have done well with corruption, what are you thinking of? Which countries are you thinking of?
So definitely we can see that country like China, their growth is very high, and definitely their corruption level is also high. Now, in Indian study, I have done one, and that is published as a book chapter, where because the problem is doing corruption as a single country study because of data set. Because annual data we cannot do like 1985 too. So because I bought that monthly data from International Countries Guide, where we have shown that there is a non-linear relationship with that economic growth and corruption. Maybe if the corruption level goes low, in that case maybe it is growth enhancing, so that growth enhancing effect is there. But if corruption is very high, that means maybe we say every political leaders we can think of that corrupt. So in that case, as an investor or as an individual, when we need something from the government, we cannot believe anyone. So it is high pervasiveness. So in that case, definitely even that political leader says, yes, I'll do your work, but I have no faith, because if there is a high pervasiveness of corruption, then probability of getting caught and punished is very low. So in that part of case, we can see that it has a negative effect on growth. So that individual study shows on India 1984 to 2013, I think, that there is a non-linear effect on corruption and growth. So when it's very low, that is growth affecting, enhancing. But when corruption goes very high, that has negative effect on growth.
And what about Modi? Sorry. I don't want to let you off the
So this is again debatable issue nowadays, because maybe India is used to of that corruption. People think that, oh, everyone. Now in that case, maybe a lot of people, they look Modi as more autocratic democrat. So in that case, that changing stage, it is, if we think of in terms of business, maybe it is very difficult now. It is not enough time that shows that credibility to believe. So maybe the effect we can see because of Modi is not, still we can quantify the effect.
I'm going to be a devil's advocate, if I may. So at each stage, each measure that you're using, it calls for a leap of faith. You start off with Transparency International. I mean, Peter Eigen himself has said repeatedly that these are objective measures. They are perceptions of investors who are coming into the country to invest, and they are volatile, and they are subject to their own outcomes and experiences, and how they've navigated. Democracy, again, I mean, there are multiple ways you're measuring. Freedom House is just one, which is very closely aligned with the Heritage Foundation, and they've got very clear ideological basis. My broader question is, how much meaning do you derive out of these very broad brush country studies? Barrow himself, who did the first one, puts in more than a pinch, there's a quart of salt which you need to attach, and that goes with the most recent one. You would have seen Asimoglu and Robinson and a host of others. First question, first of all, how meaningful is it to conduct these studies? Secondly, if you're talking about corruption, there are multiple different kinds of corruption. One of which is, let's say you're looking at tenders, right? Usually the firm, if it's a firm that's less efficient, I mean, your ultimate aspiration in economics is allocative efficiency, right? And that's what's going to lead. You plow funds into the best industry. So what I found curiously missing in a lot of this analysis is the moment you open up the windows and doors, as is a profoundly important part of the explanation for East Asia, you're subject to competition, you're out in the open, and you're vulnerable to any more competitive firm that comes in. You don't get your act together, you're out, right? There's a major difference between Latin America and here, even if you abstract from corruption indices. The other is, what I think is more meaningful, is looking at sectors. Again, you mentioned India repeatedly. One of the most efficient sectors is the high tech, where there really isn't any regulation. There's minimal intervention by the state, so minimal scope for rent seeking. And that cuts across most of the planet also in the new tech industries, where there's a minimum weight of the state's hand. You find the winners are the most efficient firms, and you've got a bunch of outside players coming in. By contrast, if you look at public works, that's an extremely murky sector without exception, be it the United States, be it the OECD, be it any country on the planet. The public works is very opaque. It's impossible to measure, where how graft comes in and what the efficient or inefficient outcomes are, unless you can again look at the micro level evidence. Right? So the point once again is how much of an inference can you draw on between, let's say you mentioned Sierra Leone on one hand, Ecuador, or somebody else, and what do you take back? And isn't a lot of this eventually winds up being on ex post rationalizing? So we find a story, and as economists, we're pretty good at finding a story after things have happened and it's all dusted and done, right? And again, so if one would take a kitchen sink approach, why shouldn't an income distribution be included? There is again fairly robust evidence for the fact that the more egalitarian a distribution, the less is the potential and tolerance for and need for graft as well, right? That's another measure that you include, or the level of financial development, which should incorporate how much internal scrutiny you have of how funds are going. So, in short, I think there are again several leaps of faith across the different measures and the variables that you use. At the end of the day, how much do we take away from reserve analysis? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your comment. Yes, that is, we all know that there is a problem. Sometimes there are different way of looking at, but sometimes it is very difficult to data limitations, and that is our limitation. Sometimes we say we want to but in terms of economic freedom, we say, if I want to do a business and if I don't need lot of restrictions, that so here we haven't focused on that, but one of my paper that focus on which one is very important, economic freedom or democracy. So here we can see maybe democracy is not that important that can control corruption, but economic freedom is very important, because why corruption is generating? Corruption is generating because to do something, we are going to the public officials or political leaders. So that is the thing is, if a country, say for example, country like Singapore, we say, even we don't say it is highly democratic countries, but in terms of economic freedom, that is, I think, top in terms of political freedom. So that can have a major effect in controlling corruption. And if we look at, like I have shown in the most of the South Asian countries, their economic freedom is very, very restricted. Even we say India that after liberalization, but if we look at the scale, democracy is there, but economic freedom is very restricted.
So I think one very often is conflating two very different notions in the East Asian paradox. The whole term came up in the context that they weren't adopting the Washington Consensus, which was being advocated by the World Bank. These countries had a repressed financial sector, but openness.
Yeah.
Right? And that's what ensured that funds were flowing efficiently, and that's what essentially paved the foundations. And I'm not sure how confidently can assert that democratization, which is almost seemed to be an inevitable concomitant of growth, can be ruled out, and that these countries found their feet during autocratic regime. Park Chung-hee, yes, in South Korea, but the consolidation took place much later. The problems with the chaebols were addressed much later, and Japan has been, what the LDP did, it's been a fairly robust democracy. So in the Southeast and East Asian case, if you parse through, again, I'm not sure how robust the aggregated findings turn out to be.
I think that is an important suggestion and comments, and definitely maybe we can look at to bring that into this framework to see that what is the South Asian paradox is contributing. Is it only the democratic or autocratic structure, or maybe the other thing. That is, we need to think of that, how we can incorporate that in that to bring that effect. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We're out of time. I would also, unfortunately, Shojin has had to leave, but this is her newest book that we'd like to give you as a thank you from ISIS and on India, and maybe touching on some of the issues that you mentioned in your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for